Welcome to Trigger the Truth with attorney Jason Gaida, where we unravel the ins and outs of Massachusetts firearms law.
Welcome to Trigger the Truth, Massachusetts Firearms Laws and Policy with attorney Jason Gaida. I'm excited to talk to Jason today because we're going to dive into this topic of firearms-related self-defense cases. So, Jason, to get us started, how often are you seeing these types of cases arise in Massachusetts?
Self-defense cases is a large part of my practice. It is I would say, a cultural thing here in Massachusetts where I tell clients, potential clients throughout Massachusetts that you should expect that if you display your firearm, even if you believe what you're doing is lawful, you should expect that it's likely you're going to be arrested and it's likely you're going to be prosecuted. People in Massachusetts have to remember, we're not in Texas. It's not the same types of law and the same perspective when it comes to self-defense. Particularly, the issue that we often see is Massachusetts is not a stand your ground state. We have a duty to retreat when you're outside of your home. And that oftentimes is where the real conflict exists between whether or not the actions of my clients is actually lawful. Did they have an opportunity to de-escalate, to leave the situation before they engage in the use of force?
What exactly is meant by a duty to retreat? What does that look like practically? Or are there any really specific parameters around which you can say that that was met in any given case?
Excellent question about specific parameters too, because every self-defense situation is a fact-specific situation. You move one factor here or one there, you change, where you're standing or how far away the person is or how big they are or what you said or what they did. That changes the fact pattern and possibly the outcome. With our duty to retreat, what I try to explain to people, and I do a lot of trainings throughout Massachusetts. I do self-defense trainings, largely sponsored by self-defense insurance companies. And I explain to people that when you have a self-defense situation, you should expect that you're likely to go to trial, and a jury is going to be sitting there listening to the facts and the evidence, and the jury is going to get instructions about our self-defense law. And summarizing what they're going to be told is that in order to engage in lawful self-defense, number one, you have to be in fear of some sort of imminent harm or danger to yourself. Secondly, you can't use more force than is actually reasonably necessary in that particular situation, again, based on those facts. And then finally, when you're outside of your home, you have an absolute duty to retreat, to disengage, to avoid conflict before using force. And what the jury is going to be told is that duty to retreat is really based on the facts and circumstances. Was there an opportunity for you to leave before you used force? The jury is also going to be instructed that if the opportunity is there to call the police, did you call the police before you engaged in the use of force? What our law expects and what our case law expects is that you will do everything possible before you actually pull that firearm and really before you pull that trigger to avoid any sort of harm to anyone else, even if that person seems like he or she is going to harm you.
As a layman of the law, not understanding the intricacies and the ins and outs as you do, to me it sounds like what is required of somebody put in such a situation is basically Massachusetts requires, I don't want to sound flippant or anything, but it does seem like there is a checklist of things to do well before firearms are involved. And so from your experience, how dutiful would you say the average gun owner is in making sure that those things are fulfilled in a self-defense situation?
Some better than others. And, I have clients from all walks of life and all different types of experiences. I've had clients that have, had very minimal training who have made the right decision in the right situations. Then I've had clients that have gone through extensive trainings, trainings at different academies and with different instructors who made the wrong choice in a certain situation. You're right. There is a sort of a checklist. The first one is easy, typically easy. Am I in imminent fear of harm, right? That can typically be immediately assessed in that situation. Does he have a weapon? Is he coming at me? Is he bigger, faster, stronger than me? Is he going to harm me? Typically, most people can make that determination instantly. And then use of force. Typically, people start with notifying the person you have a firearm, displaying it, going into the ready position before they actually use it. And again, that duty to retreat really is very fact-specific situation. Can you run? Can you call the police? Is there some sort of way to avoid this conflict? I will tell you, though, the real key here, what's going to underline making the right decision, and that's really your emotional response to a stressful situation. If you're a person that loses their cool, if you're a person that is likely to react emotionally and confrontationally to stressful situations, someone takes your parking spot, the day before Christmas at the mall, someone cuts you off in traffic, someone, says something to you or the person you're with that was, inappropriate. What kind of person are you? Are you a person that rises to that? Is that you a person that's going to engage in that back and forth? If you are that kind of person, you probably should assess where you're at and whether you should be carrying a firearm in that situation. Because if you can't control those emotions, that desire to fight all the time, you're very likely going to get into trouble, particularly with the duty to retreat, because there's this idea that you stand up for yourself and no one's going to push you around on the playground and you're going to push back. Well, if you have that mentality and you have a gun in Massachusetts, you should expect to be prosecuted. The prosecutors, the district attorneys take these cases very seriously. The police take them very seriously. There isn't a whole lot of leniency in these types of situations here in this Commonwealth.
Let me ask you, what rights and responsibilities do gun owners in Massachusetts have when defending themselves or others?
Again, it comes down to those three factors, what the jury is going to be told. As a gun owner in Massachusetts, you should be mindful of the duty to retreat, using appropriate force, and making sure you only use force if you're actually in danger. You also should be mindful, you shouldn't be looking for trouble. You should always remember that firearm is on your hip. And that changes the dynamic when, again, someone steals your parking spot or someone cuts you off in traffic. Because remember, number one, people lie. If somebody says, you go and get in a back and forth in traffic on the highway and somebody says, he pulled a gun on me. Well, along comes the police. And if they pull you over and you have a gun on your hip, it's really hard to say you didn't do it, right? Keep in mind that carrying that firearm is a significant responsibility. Keep in mind the culture here in Massachusetts, how law enforcement reacts to that firearm, how other people react to seeing a firearm. You have to be mindful of that at all times. Because again, there's a certain type of reaction. And I'll give you a real life scenario. I had a client that was involved in a situation where he was out shopping with his wife. He pulled into a parking lot and he looked across the parking lot, kind of at the next, row of spots. And he sees a man holding a small, looked like a girl, but it was a young woman, grabbing her by the arms and shoving her into a car. And he tells his wife, call 911. He thought it was an abduction, actually. And he had his license to carry. He had a firearm on his hip. He gets out of the car. He approaches that individual. And by that time, the individual had walked over to the driver's seat. And he said, hey, stop. And the guy gets out of the car and he starts getting argumentative, using profanity towards my client, and starts coming at my client. And my client puts his hand up and he says, whoa, whoa, whoa. And he puts his hand on his firearm, pulls it out and points it down at the ground, right? Puts it in the ready position, and he's telling the guy to stop. Don't come any closer. Well, of course, what happens right at that situation? Police come whipping around the corner, tackle my client to the ground, disarm him, arrest him, right? Eventually, they figure out the other guy was the cause of this problem. It was a domestic violence situation, and he was assaulting his girlfriend. And they arrest him eventually as well. But my client got arrested too. Police see that gun, they react. That is how what we experience as gun owners in Massachusetts. You need to be ready for that. You need to be mindful of that.
Given that situation that you just described, what distinctions are made between defending yourself, defending others, defending one's property, even in Massachusetts?
Starting with defending someone else, the similar factors really apply. The same things that we've talked about, the amount of force used, is that person in danger? Oftentimes you're really putting yourself in that person's, situation. So you need to kind of be mindful of the entire situation ongoing. And again, if you're not the one being threatened, keep in mind that duty to retreat piece. When the jury's instructed, they're going to be told, did that defendant have the opportunity to call the police? You should be the one calling 911, particularly if somebody else is in danger. You should do it immediately before you take action, okay? Property is a really good question because, in states even around Massachusetts, oftentimes you can use lethal force to protect property rights. Absolutely not in Massachusetts. You can use some force, you can use non-lethal force, so that's why like a loss prevention officer can stop a guy running out of a store with, a stereo under his arm. They're allowed to hold them and maybe tackle them to keep them from leaving. And kind of the same thing in your house. Someone's trying to steal your car out of your driveway. You might be able to try to pull them out of the car, and that might be the appropriate use of force, but you sure can't, come out your front door blasting. And people need to be wary of that. It gets really kind of interesting, if you will, when you have somebody in your home. Now, in your home, we do have the castle doctrine, so we're not completely backwards. And the castle doctrine says that you're allowed to protect yourself in your home. You don't have a duty to retreat inside your home. But the other two factors apply. Is the use of force reasonable? And are you actually in danger, right? Of some sort of harm. It's one thing, you often see these scenarios where, the guy's coming down the stairs in the dark and his wife's hiding behind him, and you've got the guy with the mask, breaking in, and he's creeping through the living room. Those are the kind of the scenarios that, media wants you to see. More likely than not, most thieves don't want to be caught. And, if you do catch them, they're probably going to try to flee. So be mindful of that. If you shoot a guy in the back as he's running out the door with the TV, there's a good chance that you're going to be arrested, charged, and you may end up being convicted of that.
I'd love for you to perhaps actually expand on what the reasonableness of these situations look like in the cases you've handled. What would you say in a specific scenario was an unreasonable use of force versus a reasonable use of force, just for the audience to understand a bit better?
I can give some real world examples. I had a case some time ago where it was kind of a back and forth traffic type incident where my client felt like he was being harassed by a couple that were in a car. And I've actually had a couple of scenarios like this, but, there was a male and a female in a car, and they were kind of doing the old cut each other off in traffic kind of thing, and beeping and brake standing and stuff. But eventually they get to a point where they end up kind of next to each other, and the guy in the car kind of lifts his hand up and makes like kind of a gesture at my client. And it's at that point my client pulls out his gun and like whips open the door and is like, I've got my gun, I'll show you. That's going to be a problem, right? That amount of force probably isn't reasonable. You still have a duty to retreat. You could have driven away before you engage in that. Instead, you continued to engage, right? Those are going to be situations that are going to be very tough. Like, in the mindset of a jury, like they're kind of seeing the situation, they understand what's going on here, but then they're told what the law is. And if they apply the law, you're going to have a problem. But another example, I had a client, this is my most recent trial, a self-defense trial. I had a client that was honestly bringing his dog to a pet store to get the dog a bath. And it was at a busy urban area. It was kind of like a mall. And, he's bringing his dog across the street, and two guys across the street see him, and one of them seems to think he's somebody and says something to him. Well, it turns out the two guys across the street were gang members, and one of those gang members was carrying a firearm. And my client, luckily, he just kind of had a sense that something was off. He didn't know what the guy said to him, but he just felt weird. And he stepped back towards his car at the same time the guy across the street pulled out and started firing at my client. Dove behind the car with his dog. My client gets back up and he starts firing back. And at trial, we were able to show, look, my client was in danger, throughout that interaction, not only because the guy was still firing, but where my client was kind of pinned down behind the car. He was actually on a sidewalk on a public street. And as the guy who was shooting at him was kind of firing and fleeing, he could have simply went across the street and been able to have a clear shot down the sidewalk and hit my client. And behind my client was open parking lot area. He had nowhere to go, nowhere to flee. At the end of the day, quite frankly, the police, even at that trial, were basically admitting, he had no choice here. He had to defend himself. That case is really kind of, again, the cautionary note, kind of the takeaway from these types of interactions. As I tell people, my client did all the right things. He checked on bystanders. He called 911. He waited at the scene. He had self-defense insurance. He called his self-defense insurance, which contacted me immediately. He did all the right things. He still, as soon as the police got there, disarmed, arrested, brought to court. The prosecutor tried to have him held with no bail while his case was pending. He ended up on a GPS bracelet while his case was pending. That's how they treat these types of situations, even one that seems like a no-brainer to most people. There was a video. You could see it. We knew that it was a gang member shooting at him. Didn't matter to the prosecutor in the end of the day. We had to go to trial, and it took over a year to get to trial.
Again, a great reminder. I think it bears repeating whenever we can for people to understand the legal system works slower than you'd expect. And even when it seems like a no-brainer, just like as you explained with this case, it's just not how the justice system operates. And so being prepared, you mentioned self-defense insurance. Tell us a bit more about that and how that factors in to gun ownership in Massachusetts.
There are a number of different insurance policies out there. Our firm works with all of them. What it does, quite frankly, is cover your legal expenses. You got to understand, particularly in the Massachusetts market, lawyers are expensive. Trials, even in a district court level, can be upwards of $10,000. Superior court's even more expensive. And if you're charged with a homicide, that's a significant expenditure on your end. And, typically what these insurance companies do is they will work with our office. They contact me and I work with them to, explain, how self-defense is going to be applied in this case, walk through the facts and, work with them on the billings so that the insurance company is covering your bills rather than you yourself. I've had a number of clients use it. In most cases, it's a good thing to have. Being very honest, the self-defense insurance company is not going to cover you if, you're out there, wildly firing your gun at people and, it's an assault, not self-defense. But in situations where, again, even in a state like Massachusetts where it's really gray, generally the self-defense insurance companies are a good option.
This has been Trigger the Truth, Massachusetts Firearms Laws and Policy with attorney Jason Gaida. Thanks, Jason, for all that you've given us to think about.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments. Welcome to Trigger the Truth with attorney Jason Gaida, where we unravel the ins and outs of Massachusetts firearms law.